Did the Romans really come up with the idea of a tank before anyone else? Is this bronze blade really from the lance of a defeated Nephilim? Today's video is jam-packed with crazy weapons of the ancient world. The Romans designed this military machine first. The war machines created by Leonardos were so ahead of their time that some have accused him of being a time traveler. He designed things like armored warships, portable bridges, mobile siege towers, and armored wagons. Some of his inventions would have still been useful in World War I. Leonardos lived almost 2,000 years before the First World War. His work is from the age of the Roman Empire, specifically in the 4th century AD. Little is known about Belich's life or where he came from. Only a few of his texts survive, showing unimaginable military innovations designed to strengthen the Roman army. After the death of Emperor Constantine I in 337, Rome was in a tough position. They were facing invasions on all fronts and needed to strengthen their borders and their military. Barbarian tribes posed the greatest threat to the empire. Thus, new and creative weapons were needed, like the armored warship. This was one of Belich's more ambitious proposals. He designed a vessel completely covered in shielding that would make it impervious to enemy projectiles. Even under heavy fire, the ship wouldn't break apart, and the sailors would remain not filled with arrows. Wouldn't you rather fight on an armored warship than a normal warship? Belichus also came up with a way to enhance most siege engines. He figured out how to create a portable bridge that would allow the Roman army to rapidly cross rivers. He increased the range of ballistae and catapults, and he incorporated animals into the war machines. For example, he had an idea for an oxen-powered paddle boat and oxen-powered siege towers. One of the more sophisticated ideas was for an armored wagon. Belichus drew up designs for a mobile fortification that would protect infantry and archers while allowing them to move closer to the enemy's position. I call it an armored wagon, but it was more of a tank. Do you know who else came up with the idea for a tank long before the first one was ever built? That would be none other than Leonardo da Vinci, and there will be more on him coming up later in the video. These ancient bioweapons are terrifying. Biological warfare has been used to wipe out armies since 1500 BC. Ancient humans figured out how to weaponize the plague to topple entire civilizations. Not just the plague either. You're in for a world of horror. I'm talking fungus, tetanus, snake bombs, and more. The earliest record of intentional biological warfare is in the Hittite texts. Chroniclers wrote that an unknown plague was driven into enemy lands to cause an epidemic. The plague was likely tularemia, also known as rabbit fever. It's still around today, with infections reported in every US state except Hawaii. The Hittites took infected victims, drove them like cattle into their enemies' borders, and waited for everyone to get sick before they attacked. You can survive rabbit fever today thanks to medical intervention, but that wasn't the case 3,500 years ago. The Assyrians also engaged in biological warfare. They were known to use the fungus ergot to poison enemy wells. They would send a spy into an enemy city to poison the entire water supply. Have you ever played a video game in which you can dip your weapons into different poisons for special buffs? This isn't just a video game mechanic. It was something that Roman warriors and Scythian archers would do before they went into battle. Only their idea of poison is more disgusting. Archers would dip their arrows into fresh human waste, and Roman soldiers smeared their swords in it. The result was catastrophic. Even if somebody hit with an arrow didn't die immediately, they would be infected by tetanus and die later. I don't think I want to be a warrior in antiquity. It sounds horrible. I haven't even gotten to the most disturbing biological weapon yet. That horrific honor goes to the Mongol warriors of the Golden Horde. In 1346, the Mongols threw dead human bodies over the walls of the Crimean city of Kaffa. There is some disagreement among scholars over what was responsible for the spread of the plague in Europe during the 14th century. Some think the Mongols are to blame for kicking off the Black Death because they catapulted the dead bodies of plague victims into Kaffa. They were like fleshy disease bombs, the deadliest of all biological agents. It was shortly after this horrible assault on the Crimean city that Europe was engulfed by the Black Death, resulting in an estimated 25 million deaths. Could the worst plague humanity has ever seen really be the fault of biological warfare? Now what about mosquito armies and snake bombs? Should we move on to ancient nuclear warfare or talk about how Rome used 300 square miles of marshland to breed malaria-infected mosquitoes? I think the mosquitoes deserve a mention. Rome's Pontina marshes were used like a toxic moat against invading armies. Even the legendary General Hannibal was thwarted when his army was attacked by mosquitoes and everyone started dying of malaria. The malaria-ridden mosquitoes got so out of hand that some experts believe malaria spread throughout Rome, helping to cripple the capital in its final days, leaving it vulnerable to attack from barbarians. Here's a fun tidbit of information you can bring up on your next business lunch. In World War II, the German army repeated history by flooding the marshes and turning them into a bioweapon. The Allied forces were thwarted from entering Rome because they didn't want to move through the malaria-infested marshes. Only it backfired again, just as it had backfired on the Romans. Italy was the one that suffered. Malaria outbreaks struck Rome in 1944, causing unimaginable death and devastation. Last but hardly least, Hannibal devised a venomous weapon to use against the Romans. He had his soldiers catch venomous snakes, stick them into clay jars, and then launch snake bombs at enemy ships. Egyptian warriors in helicopters. Ancient Egyptian warriors went to battle in helicopters. At least that's what a baffling series of hieroglyphs found in an ancient temple seemed to suggest. The temple has hieroglyphs of a helicopter, a submarine, and something that looks like a stealth fighter. The experts don't know what to make of these impossible hieroglyphs. They've been interpreted as fighting vehicles, weapons of war that the Egyptians couldn't possibly have had access to 3,000 years ago. Impossible or not, the carvings exist. They're etched into the walls of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, one of the oldest cities in all of Egypt. The first carvings were made during the reign of Seti I, who sat upon the Egyptian throne from 1294 to 1279 BC. But let me ask you a question. If Egyptians did have access to helicopters and submarines, why aren't there any surviving examples of this incredible technology? Because it may not have been the Egyptians who built them. The hieroglyph that looks like a stealth fighter could also be interpreted as a flying saucer. What I'm wondering is if the Egyptians merely witnessed these advanced war machines but didn't build them. Okay, then who did? That's for you to decide based on the facts at hand. Archaeologists have blamed the helicopter hieroglyphs on a phenomenon called pareidolia. Pareidolia is what happens when you look at a cloud and see a fire-breathing dragon. Archaeologists say the hieroglyphs are real inscriptions that happen to look like flying machines. What do you say to that? This is a real Nephilim weapon. The Nephilim may be gone, but a fragment of one of their weapons remains. A group of amateur archaeologists believe they have in their possession an ancient bronze blade once wielded by a biblical giant. The book of Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 tells us that the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man and they bore children to them. These were the ancient heroes, men of renown. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 has been interpreted from every angle for over 1,000 years. It all boils down to the same meaning. Genesis is telling us that a group of beings from the stars arrived on Earth, bred with human women, and created a mixed race of giant monsters. Well, guess what? Christians aren't the only ones who tell this story. Native tribes have been passing down an identical legend for centuries. Across North America, the tribes told tales of the Star People. The Star People were a lot like angels. They came down from the heavens, and just like God's angels, they took human women to bed. From this unholy union, giants were created. And what do you suppose the great creator of Native American lore did when this happened? The creator sent a flood to destroy the abominable giants. These giants wielded impossibly huge weapons. Oral tradition describes brutal warfare waged between the giants and the humans, sort of like in the tale of David and Goliath. It would seem even after the flood, not every giant was gone. In the aftermath, humans had to go to war against the surviving monsters to defeat them once and for all. In a remote area of Michigan, a bronze artifact was discovered by amateur excavators. It was recently presented at the Nephilim Mounds Conference to renowned researcher L.A. Marzulli. Although not confirmed, the slender blade is being hailed as a fragment of a weapon used by giants. Native American tradition tells us that the giant abominations wielded swords so long they could impale 3 people on the blade. This blade is exactly long enough to stick through 3 sizable male torsos. It also weighs about 24 pounds. I don't know if you've ever gotten into a sword fight before, but I assure you 24 pounds is too much to be swinging around in one hand. This long blade would easily have fit into a wooden shaft about 8 feet long. It's the perfect size to be a Nephilim war lance. But is the artifact legitimate? It was allegedly sent to a laboratory to have the metal tested. Amazingly, the metal was found to have originated in the Middle East, in the homeland of Goliath. Unfortunately, none of this information has been confirmed by mainstream scientists. This artifact is a real object, and it was supposedly found in the Lake Superior region, but the mainstream archaeological community is ignoring it. Either archaeologists know it's a forgery and don't need to investigate, or they're too afraid to investigate. Perhaps they're afraid because they might find out the truth. The truth being that the Nephilim waged war against man from the Great Plains to Jerusalem. And now for a quick break. But first, I wanted to give a shout out and big thank you to Ken Matheson and Bonnie Mason for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. This world has seen nuclear war. There are some who believe ancient nuclear weapons fell upon the world thousands of years ago and scorched cities to ash. There are even written records of this forgotten atomic war. But if you prefer a more concrete sort of evidence, I have some that I think you'll find very convincing. In Hinduism, the Mahabharata and Ramayana are 2 of the most important texts of all time. Both books speak of the deeds of a ruling dynasty known as the Kuru clan. Central in both texts is an account of a war that broke out between 2 rival families of the Kuru clan. The details of this war are terrifyingly familiar to things that happened only 70 years ago. The Kurukshetra War was fought with Vimanas, described in the ancient texts as flying vehicles that could deliver explosive weapons. Vimanas are a staple of Hindu lore. They were the vehicles of the gods, able to move over land, through the sea, and even in space. When it came to wartime, Vimanas could drop bombs just as devastating as the ones dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The atomic battles fought between the rival families are described in a section of the Mahabharata called the Drona Parva. One passage says that when the explosive weapon was dropped, crowds of warriors with steeds and elephants and weapons were carried away as if they were dry leaves of trees. Here's another verse that will chill your blood and give you goosebumps. Gurkha, flying a swift and powerful Vimana, hurled a single projectile charged with the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns, rose with all its splendor. If that isn't the description of an atomic bomb going off, I don't know what it is. The passages of the Mahabharata are indistinguishable from any modern history book describing the nuclear strike on Japan in the 1940s. I don't know how these ancient clans developed atomic weapons. Perhaps they were left behind by an even more advanced civilization. Or maybe history just isn't what we think it is. In 1996, even more evidence was found that ancient cultures had access to nuclear arms. A mineralogist was at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo when they noticed something peculiar about 2 necklaces recovered from the tomb of Tutankhamun. In the center of each necklace was a yellow-green stone. It was peculiar enough that the mineralogist was able to get some testing done on the gems. The tests revealed that they were made of glass, but the glass predated the earliest records of Egyptian civilization. It took a lot of work, but geologists finally traced the bizarre pieces of glass to a remote region of the Sahara Desert. The glass came from a place where there is no glass, so how in the world did it get there? Astronomical chemist Christian Coburl determined that the glass was created during a high-temperature event. The first thought was that a meteorite impacted the Sahara, crystallizing the sand into a unique type of glass from the spike in heat. The issue is that there are no signs of an impact crater in the region where the glass was found. The next possibility is the one that's scary. If it wasn't a meteorite, then perhaps it was a weapon capable of melting sand that created the desert glass. The only weapon scientists know of that can create that kind of heat is an atomic bomb. If you think nuclear war was waged in the ancient past, let me know in the comments. The biggest warship in history. Picture the biggest boat you've ever seen and then double it. The Greeks built a warship so big that it was a city on the sea. If the records from antiquity are correct, the 2,000-year-old boat was the biggest person-powered ship that has ever floated. The Titanic has got nothing on the Tessera Conteres. According to the surviving texts, the Tessera Conteres was a catamaran galley built by Ptolemy IV, Philopator of Egypt in the 3rd century BC. Detailed records of the ship can be found in a work of Calixenus of Rhodes, who appears to have seen it firsthand. But just how big are we talking? The Tessera Conteres was 280 cubits long, 38 cubits wide, and 48 cubits to the top of the gunwale. Each of the 4 rudders was 30 cubits long. The ship was so big, it had 2 heads and 2 sterns. There were 4,000 rowers required just to get the beastly ship moving. You might be a little frustrated because you probably don't know how long a cubit is. Well, neither do most people. Luckily, I have the conversions handy. 280 cubits is 420 feet. That means the ship was 57 feet wide and 72 feet up to the prow. The measurements are impressive, but by no means was this the longest boat ever. The largest ship ever built is the Seawise Giant, 15,000 feet long. The Seawise Giant was an oil tanker that could move more than 4.5 million barrels of crude oil at a time. The Tessera Conteres was no oil tanker though, it was a warship, and it was powered completely by humans and long spoon-shaped pieces of wood, known as oars. The enormous vessel was the greatest naval weapon of antiquity, but there's no trace of it left. There also aren't any records of what happened to it. The boat may have been so big that it proved ineffective, or maybe it sank. Its fate is an unsolved mystery. The mighty god of war. Do you know the name of the god most Roman soldiers prayed to? His name was Jupiter Dolicinus, and he may have been the most devastating superweapon of the Roman Empire. Archaeologists recently uncovered a beautiful gold offering to Jupiter in the ruins of a Roman fortress. The fortress was found in Georgia and is at least 1,800 years old. That's Georgia as in the country, not the state. I love the idea of ancient Romans in America, but that's a story for another day. Be sure to check out all the latest videos from the channel. The votive offering is a thin gold plate inscribed in Greek writing. The team of Polish and Georgian archaeologists have called it a unique discovery. Natalie Lockley from the University of Warsaw said, Jupiter Dolicinus was the ultimate god of war and victory. You might be wondering about the second part of the god's name. Jupiter is famous as the god of war in Rome, lord of the sky, god of lightning, and master of the storm, whereas Dolicinus is not very famous at all today. The truth is that he was an ancient god associated with thunder. He had a cult in the city of Dolice. No one is sure exactly how it happened, but the two gods mixed in the 1st century AD. By the time Christianity became a major religion, Roman soldiers had taken Jupiter Dolicinus as their military deity of victory. If they were going to overcome their enemies, they had to make offerings to the war god. I wonder what kind of power the war god gave his loyal followers. Unfortunately, historians don't know because the cult kept their secrets close to their chest. In Rome, there were public cults and there were closed cults. Before Christianity took off, the Roman Empire existed with a system of public religion in which people could join whichever cults they wanted. Rome was a rich religious landscape with dozens of cults that people could join depending on which gods they wished to worship. The most popular were the cults of Mithras, Isis, and Cybele. The cult of Jupiter Dolicinus was a closed cult, meaning no outsiders allowed. They may as well have had a sign on the door of their clubhouse saying, "No girls allowed," in all caps with a big exclamation point. It was mostly soldiers in the cult, and they all had to undergo initiation rites before they were accepted as devotees. Because everything was so hush-hush, the cultists weren't allowed to leave behind any evidence of their activities, so there were never documents made. Archaeologists have found 19 temples so far, they still don't have a full picture of what the cult was doing. What I wonder is how much power soldiers received from the god of war. Did their rituals make them physically stronger? Was it a placebo effect? Were the gods of the ancient world ever able to truly give their favor to those who praised them? The Chinese fire lance. Who invented guns? Was it the Egyptians, the Persians, the Romans, or the Greeks? The answer is none of the above. When archaeologists excavated the ancient Mongol capital of Xanadu, they found one of the earliest surviving guns ever. Before the Song dynasty of China began in 960 AD, alchemists discovered something very exciting. They were searching for new medicines when the alchemists realized that mixing nitrates created a chemical explosion. A little saltpeter here, a little pinch of sulfur there, add in some charcoal, kaboom! The Chinese word for gunpowder literally translates to fire medicine. It wasn't long before Chinese soldiers were using fire arrows and bombs fueled by gunpowder. Then came the guns, primitive cannons that were actually more like flamethrowers. In 1150 AD, Song dynasty soldiers wielded fire lances. They were incredibly effective, especially against enemy combatants who had never seen a pyrotechnic display before. A fire lance was a spear with a gunpowder bomb wrapped around the end of it. Think of a spear with a Roman candle on it, spraying enemies with fire and sparks. In the beginning, the gunpowder devices weren't particularly dangerous, but as the Chinese refined their usage of gunpowder, the explosive discharge was increased. Chinese soldiers started adding pellets to the explosive, which resulted in a combination flamethrower/shotgun. Believe it or not, but this is the very real history of the gun. It started with spears strapped with explosives, but by the 13th century, things had evolved. Fire lances had their own metal barrels to withstand stronger explosions. The spear point of the lance was thrown away because it wasn't necessary anymore. Soldiers were left with really long-barreled guns that relied strictly on a gunpowder blast. Make no mistake, these were the earliest guns in the world. Only instead of bullets, they used iron pellets and shards of pottery. A slow match was ignited, a gunpowder tube would eject some flames, and pottery shards would fly out of the barrel like shrapnel. Ouch, that would do some damage. When archaeologists dug up Xanadu, the old summer capital of Kublai Khan in the 13th century, they found some of the oldest examples of fire lances. These early guns were so sophisticated that they looked more like small bronze hand cannons than fire lances. One was even stamped with a serial number and a date, 1298, just like any modern gun. Leonardo's deadly inventions. Leonardo da Vinci designed one of the earliest armored vehicles in human history. He also devised new guns and war machines that would change the world forever. We already learned about the Roman inventor who tried to build the world's first tank, but there aren't any records that he pulled it off. In 1487, da Vinci got much closer to making his tank a reality. Leonardo's fascination with war machines began during his time in the service of military leader Caesar Borgia. His role was that of a military engineer. He was given freedom to design and implement new war machines, and he would have made them too if not for the limitations of Renaissance technology. Some of the things Leonardo tried to make include giant crossbows, a machine gun, an armored car, and a helicopter. You really have to wonder where da Vinci got his genius from. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, and in his downtime engineered killing machines. He was a musician and a mathematician on top of his other hobbies. Who out there can barely draw a stick figure and can't even do subtraction without a calculator? Don't worry, I'm pretty sure da Vinci was an alien. His machine gun had 33 barrels. It was one of the earliest concepts for a weapon that could shoot rapidly. The guns were arranged in 3 rows of 11. The idea behind the massive firepower was that a single row of guns could be fired while the other 2 rows were cooling and reloading. His armored car was even more impressive. Da Vinci designed a circular platform attached to wheels and axles, sheltered by a protective shell. It was like a big wooden turtle, only with a small array of light cannons. The occupants inside would stay safe while bombarding people with their guns. If da Vinci had ever built it, it would have been the first tank. I bet you're curious about the giant crossbow I mentioned earlier. After all, what in the world would you need a huge crossbow for? Da Vinci designed it as a siege engine. The crossbow was big enough that it could shoot flaming bombs at the walls of the city. It could shoot bolts big enough to smash through any stone fortification. It was like a catapult and a crossbow mixed into one. Sadly, it's unknown if Da Vinci's giant crossbow was ever built. Most of his inventions exist today only as sketches in his notebook. If you could bring one of his ideas to life, which one would you choose? The ancient death ray. Forget about guns, bombs, and machines of war. Let's check out an ancient death beam, a ray of pure energy that sank Roman ships and set people on fire. Archimedes was a mad genius born in 287 BC. He was your typical Bond villain, only without the British accent. Archimedes grew up in the city-state of Syracuse, which at the time was part of Greece. He traveled to Egypt as a young man to gain an education. In 214, when the Roman army set sail to burn down his home, Archimedes used what he learned at school to create a diabolical doomsday machine. There is a quote from Archimedes that I absolutely love. He once said, "Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the world." Those are some bold words. When the Roman ships arrived at the fortified walls of Syracuse, they were greeted by a giant metal claw attached to a crane mechanism. The claw was so big and strong that it could grasp Roman ships by their front, pick them up, and let them tip backwards into the sea. But the claw wasn't enough. Archimedes' ultimate weapon of destruction was his death ray, which wasn't anything but an array of mirrors. Archimedes used concentrated sunlight reflected from huge mirrors set along the coast to burn Roman ships like a kid with a magnifying glass melting Barbie's plastic head. Scientists are dubious about this ancient legend. Archimedes was a real inventor and he made some cool stuff, but scientists doubt the effectiveness of his death ray. If it was that good at incinerating enemy ships, why didn't cities all over European coasts build their own death rays? The world's first giant gun. An engineer from Transylvania specially designed what might just be the biggest gun of the Middle Ages. He designed it for the highest bidder, making him kind of a supervillain. His name was Orban, and he was a medieval mercenary, an arms dealer selling death to whoever could pay him the most. Spoiler alert, the emperor who refused to pay Orban for his services had a very bad ending. This is such an exciting story that I want to start at the beginning. Orban was an iron founder and engineer from the Kingdom of Hungary, Transylvania specifically. No, he was not related to Count Dracula that I know of. In 1452, the genius engineer approached the Byzantine Empire and offered them his services. Emperor Constantine XI either couldn't afford Orban's high salary or didn't want to pay it. Orban offered to build the Byzantines the biggest gun the world had ever seen, but they refused his offer. The Byzantines didn't even have the necessary material to build the apocalyptic weapon Orban wanted so badly. Orban shrugged his shoulders and left the city. In hindsight, Emperor Constantine should never have let him go, because Orban left the Byzantines and went to the Ottomans, their arch-enemies. Inside the Ottoman Empire, Orban met with Sultan Mehmed II. The Sultan just so happened to be preparing for a siege on Constantinople. Orban said that for a price he would build a weapon that would blast apart the walls of Babylon itself. The Sultan paid Orban handsomely and supplied him with the materials that he needed to build what's known today as the Ottoman cannon. Amazingly, it only took Orban 3 months. You would think this kind of weapon would require years of development, but it was easy peasy. The gun was so big that once complete, it took an army of 60 to 90 oxen and 400 men to drag it from Adrianople to Constantinople. Although bombardment technology was already a thing in Europe in the 15th century, this was something unique. Unique as in devastating. The gun relied on a cannonball that weighed 1,200 pounds. It was insane that the gun even functioned. It was also able to shoot at a distance of 1 mile. There was nothing the defenders of Constantinople could do while the gun was obliterating their city walls. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1453 saw the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and a lot of it was thanks to this gun, which stripped the city of its defenses. Keep in mind that it wasn't all roses and butterflies on the Ottoman side. The intense heat created from the charge after each shot meant the gun barrel had to be soaked in warm oil. It could only be fired 3 times a day, so each shot had to count. And when it was fired, it typically killed 1 or 2 of its own operators. You couldn't even fire this thing off without killing your own people. The gun worked for 6 weeks and then quit, but it was enough to bring the Byzantine Empire to its knees. The Ottoman cannon remains one of the biggest guns ever made by human hands. Which of the monstrous machines in today's video impressed you the most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe and come back soon for more awesome stuff from the channel.